How you doing, Joe?
Doing well. I'm in Death Valley in the winter. Doesn't get much better than that. I've been showing people pressure flaking on this piece. And this is the result of some percussion flaking. In the red tub, I have examples of different types of tool stone. These rows are obsidian. This block is flint-like rock. And none of this is actually from the park, but this is a quartzite. I can't remember if it's the Eureka quartzite or not, but it extends from near Las Vegas to the north end of the park in the Johnny Formation. And it's Precambrian. The reason why it's white is there weren't any animals milling around making a mess. That's pure quartz sand that's been fused back together. And when I worked for the park years ago, I found an outcrop of that material, and on the fan below there were over 250 individual workshops for that material, and a trail that actually went back to Grapevine Canyon where the Indian village was. Probably Timbisha Shoshone, but in ethnographic literature they refer to them as the Doc family, D-O-C, and they were resident at what's now Scotty's Castle and the Mesquite Springs campground, where they were supposed to be hunting ducks. The famous Mesquite Springs ducks. If there would be grass that they could feed on. You don't think of ponds or lakes in Death Valley, but whenever I go to Darwin Falls, it's kind of mind-boggling that there's that much water in the Valley of Death. They're actually in Panamint Valley.
Joe, do you know how the current Shoshone are doing?
No, I haven't talked to them lately. I think they're doing fairly well since they built the dispensary up at the junction. They have apparently learned their lessons from the Owens Valley Paiute about how they need lawyers, and they used Indian trust lands, which are basically federal property, and Indian development money, which is again federal, to create what is and was at the time an illegal dispensary for marijuana. Seems pretty helpless, but it's getting money into the tribe. I know a woman who went to work for them a couple of years ago, and she is basically a shuttle for prescriptions, and she gets legitimate prescriptions from a doctor, goes up to Bishop and gets whatever the medicines are, brings them back and gives them to the Indians that need it. So apparently they're putting their money to good use.
Do the Native Americans ever show an interest or learn from you, or do you learn from them?
We tried to get the Timbisha interested years ago, and there was no interest. I've only known 2 Native Americans who were interested in flint knapping. One of them was a Chumash Indian who came to Death Valley. He gave me this piece of jasper. He works in a rock shop, and he cuts out arrowheads on a diamond saw and then chips them so they look like they were made in the old ways. and the other was a Navajo fella that I ran into at a campground up near Fish Lake, Utah. It's not only a lost art, but people have lost their interest in it. And happy that I'm able to do this and share this, and actually get an attaboy from some of my colleagues, because archaeologists tend to be paranoid and not talk to the public, whereas here that's my goal. Talk to the public and share with them the secrets of stone tool making. Little things like the edge of a piece of obsidian is incredibly sharp. 4 microns is a good estimate of the normal edge thickness or thinness. 4 millionths of a meter. And I have to rub all those rocks against a pebble to dull them down so that they don't leave fingers in my display. And as it warms up, I wear less clothing and I shave the hair off my arm to show people how sharp this really is.
Well, what about your beard?
No, I'm not putting anything that sharp close to my throat. The man who taught me most of what I know about this was named Don Crabtree, and he was already a world-renowned Flintknapper. He lacked the proper academic credentials because he had to drop out during the Depression to run the family business, but he had some archaeological training and had visited sites around the world. And in 1975, his claim to fame was having open heart surgery done with stone tools that he made himself. He had seen prehistoric skeletons, mummies that had healed, and he was aware that it could be done, and somehow convinced the surgeon to go along with it. And he used Oregon obsidian to do the slicing and French flint to doing the prying of the ribs, because it's the obsidian is microcrystalline. Crystals don't have time to form while it's cooling off like glass. But the French flint is a hard water deposit, and it not only do the crystals form, but they interlock. So it's known as cryptocrystalline. And need I mention that he survived a surgery and lived for another, 15 years or so.
Joe, what are your academic?
I just have a bachelor degree. I'm lucky in that I was able to do a lot of field work during my career, sometimes in positions that required a doctorate. So I would hire a PhD to work for me. That way we met all the rules. A lot of times I had more fun at work than most people have on their vacation. Backpacking from Alton, Utah to Moapa, north of Las Vegas, to the power plants that are now being shut down. And it was basically, they paid me money to go hike across the desert. And we did it in the fall and the winter, so it was pleasant. That would have been 1974 and 5. Working for the Desert Research Institute out of Reno, who were subcontractors to the Bechtel Corporation. They were basically paying me to stop their project. And archaeology has not stopped many projects, but at the final meeting, we discussed alternative alignments And as we were concluding, a biologist walked in and said, "Gentlemen, how much do you know about the spotted bat?" And it turns out that they were going to impact a threatened and endangered bat. And there were all sorts of sites that we found along the way, ranging from isolated single points to a small pueblo. And someone in the chain of command leaked out that there was a pueblo, and Utah has a very active pot hunter population. And so they went out there overnight with generators and heavy equipment and eliminated that pueblo. So by the time the people from the Historic Preservation Office got there, there was no longer a pueblo. But one good thing, it was we got them to consider the zone of influence. Their argument was, we're only digging an 8-foot wide trench. That's all you need to survey. And our argument was, no, that your workmen are interested, they're going to wander off. And as an example, we found a rock shelter where the bulldozer operator had driven up there and had screened the shelter and collected the artifacts from it, so that they ended up being responsible for like an 1/8 of a mile corridor. Fairly late in my career, I was fortunate enough to run into a man named Fred Niles. Fred, it was Mr. Niles because he was not very good at big reports and writing, so he never finished his doctoral dissertation. But he was the man who discovered the Anasazi roads in the Southwest because he had a good eye for the landscape, and he turned over a lot of ideas in my mind. He was primarily a geomorphologist, which is the intergrade between archaeology and geology.
So how good of a geomorphologist are you?
Oh, fair to middling. If you give me time to get familiar with an area like Death Valley, I mean, I love this place. I come back year after year, and I've gotten into disagreements with people. They say, "Oh, it's the people here that you love." It's like, no, it's the place itself. And those people are not here anymore.
Your favorite location in
Titus
Death Valley?
Canyon. There are several hundreds of millions of years of rocks exposed. Places where you can see that there have been torrents coming down the canyon, depositing gravel hundreds of feet up. It's just an eye-opening experience to go through it. It's primarily a driving route, and there is a ghost town, Leadfield, partway through, so you can see how hard the early miners worked.
Joe, what advice would you give a young aspiring geologist?
Don't listen to your accountant. There was a gentleman here a couple of weeks ago who had gone to school at Glasgow University in Ireland, and he started out in anthropology with an emphasis on archaeology, and his advisor talked him into becoming an engineer because the money was better. And I can guarantee that he did not enjoy his work as much as I did. I'm a volunteer for the park now, but around 2008, I actually worked for the park as an archaeologist, and I got to see parts of the park that most people never even hear about. Stephen Mather had an awful lot of insight. I've recently done a little research on him and found out he was bipolar and had incredible bouts of depression. where he would be scheduled to speak at a conference or a meeting and would not show up because he was hiding in the closet. Psychology magazine uses him as an example of how you can overcome your handicaps. He was the man who started the tourist industry in Death Valley. He built the inn. He had a borax company and made a fortune off of the borax, but had always advocated Death Valley as a tourist destination and was very strongly involved in the national park movement. He became the first director of the national park. That money that he had made off of the borax, a lot of it was spent improving national parks. For instance, at Glacier, he bought land so that they could have a visitor center. And I believe Acadia in Maine also. It was quite the humanitarian, concerned about how we needed to be aware of how wonderful these places are that deserve to be national parks.
Joe, any last parting words of wisdom?
Have fun. This is so I can remember who I am.